Hello everybody and welcome back to another Know Your Ship episode. And today I'm going to be showing you all the USS Wisconsin, one of 4 Iowa-class battleships. Now in this particular episode, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to orient you guys in terms of position. So I'm not just going to show you a room, I'm going to try to orient you to where that place might be. So first up, let's take a look at the captain's cabin, which is on the first superstructure level. Now, the captain's cabin, as you can see, is a relatively large space. And of course, the captain has his own stateroom as well. And of course, you know, as they say, rank has its privileges, and take a look at the beautiful space you would have if you were a captain aboard a battleship. And yes, I can totally confirm that big couch is as comfortable as it looks. I actually had a chance to sit in it, and of course hold one of those awesome pillows as well. Should have actually bought one or something. Now, Captain also had his own stateroom with a super comfy bed. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to go and lie down on it, although it did look pretty comfortable. Mind you, I was still pretty tempted to do that. Anyways, okay, moving up. On the second superstructure level, so one level above the captain's cabin, used to be the admiral's cabin. And the admiral's cabin was obviously a nice big space as well. Kind of like the whole rank gives you a lot of privileges, right? If you're an admiral, you're going to get better things than a captain. Well, this is what the room looks like today. And if your first reaction is, hey, where did all the nice comfy chairs and the bed go? It's because that during the last refit, essentially, to modernize the ships for service in the 80s, there were certain changes that had to be made. One of them was the fact that with all the new weapon systems and everything, the original CIC that's way down in the armored portions of the ship, well, not enough to, take in all the new systems. So they had to find a new space for it. Well, the best space is the one that's essentially pretty close to where the bridge is, and that would be the Admiral's cabin. So they repurposed this into something called the Combat Engagement Center.
TAO to bridge. Captain, I'm receiving information of enemy activity on the coast.
TAO Captain, set general quarters. General quarters. General quarters. All hands man your battle stations. This is not a drill. Set condition 1. General quarters.
Silence on the net. Air control, identify target with the unmanned aerial drone.
Target acquired. Target is control tower in enemy harbor, range 75 miles. Target identified as hostile.
Plot, estimate time on target for Tomahawk missile.
Time on target, 6 minutes. We have solution loaded to missile 1.
TAO to bridge. Captain, Tomahawk tasking received. Target is control tower in enemy harbor at 75 miles. Solution plotted and coordinates loaded. Request permission to fire Tomahawk missile.
TAO, this is the captain. Ready Tomahawk battery to fire. Tomahawk missiles free.
Standby launcher 1. Alert crews on decks to stand clear. Execute plan 1-0.
Stand clear. Stand clear. Tomahawk battery firing Tomahawk missile.
ABL-1 is elevated. Recommend vent closure. Aft doors open. Booster armed. Stand by.
Missile control. Commence firing. Fire missile 1.
Execute plan 1-0. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Launch! Missile away. Missile in flight.
Range 5 miles. Missile impact. Visual confirmation. Target destroyed.
TAO to bridge. Captain, we have visual confirmation. Target destroyed.
TAO, we have high-speed contacts on horizon to port.
Service control, identify target.
We have multiple skunks coming out of the marina. Small enemy combatants bearing 275, range 15 miles. Designated skunks Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta. Targets identified as hostile.
Gunnery, confirm target line with main battery plot.
Targets acquired. Firing solution obtained.
TAO to bridge. Captain, we have multiple skunks coming out of the marina. Small enemy combatants bearing 275, range 15 miles. Designated skunks Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta. Targets identified as hostile. Firing solution obtained. Request permission to engage with guns.
TAO Captain, surface action port guns free. Commence fire.
Gunnery, service action port.
Surface action port. All hands stand clear of the main deck while firing guns. Stand clear.
Gunnery commence firing.
Main battery, turrets 1 and 2. Take 4 targets. Bearing 275. Range 15 miles. 12 rounds. HE. Commence firing. TAO gunnery. 12 rounds. High explosives expended. Bores clear. No casualties.
Air control, damage report from drone.
Skunk Alpha direct hit. Smoke and fire. Enemy combatant breaking apart. Sinking rapidly. Skunks Bravo and Charlie direct hit. Destroyed. Skunk Delta reversing course and departing at high speed, returning to port. TAO, we have enemy combatants in the marina surrendering to the drone.
TAO to bridge. Captain, 3 targets destroyed, 1 target reversing course, and we have enemy combatants surrendering to the drone, sir.
This is the captain. Well done to the entire crew for an outstanding combat mission success. We destroyed an important land target and destroyed or routed 4 enemy combatants due to outstanding teamwork and great shooting. For the first time in known history, the enemy has surrendered to an unmanned aircraft. Bravo, Zulu. Well done. Now, secure from general quarters. Set condition 3. On deck watch section 1.
And that was a bit of a recreation in the CC using, I believe, transcripts from actual engagements during the Gulf War. So you're probably wondering, well, if this became the Combat Engagement Center and used to be the Admiral's cabin, well, where did the Admiral's cabin go? Well, they moved the Admiral's cabin 1 level down and pretty much put it right next to the Captain's cabin. And part of the reason why is the fact that they could actually share a pantry, which is highlighted right there. And so this is the view from the Admiral's cabin, and as you can see, I'm on the first superstructure level, and essentially right there is turret number 2. Yes, on that day, it was a rainy day, so I didn't get that many good outside photos. Still, I mean, it was a pretty reasonable space. I mean, it's still nice and spacious. Place for sitting, place for working. There was a pretty darn comfortable looking bed. Again, wasn't allowed to try it. And of course, you had your own personal bathroom if you're an admiral. So remember, kids, if you are going to join the Navy, make sure you get up to those higher ranks. And finally, of course, one last thing is that this was the pantry. Yeah, this is where they would have prepared food for the captain and the admiral. Although the space was in a little bit of a disarray when I went there. But you can still tell that there was, a deep fryer there. At least that looks like a deep fryer to me. And there was a grill there. So definitely an area that was meant to prepare food. And of course, there was also spaces to pass the food out into the various cabins. Moving up from the Admiral and Captain's cabin, of course, we are going to go to the bridge, which is the place where you get one of the best views of the 2 forward 16-inch turrets. And here they are in all their rain-soaked glory. Don't worry, I'm going to have something a little bit nicer a little bit later on. Just hang tight. But yeah, there they are. Glorious view from the bridge area. Now, of course, the bridge area is where the ship was basically commanded from. So here is one of the awesome chairs. And yes, you do get to sit in on it. It's a little bit hard to get into, but pretty comfortable. And then, of course, you have the conning tower. And that conning tower is very heavily protected. In excess of 17 inches of armor protection there. So about 440 millimeters, I think. This is the inside of the conning tower. Quite a bit smaller, and the view from inside is not so good. All you have are these very, very small viewing slots that you can look out of. Much better view if you are outside the conning tower with all the windows. Unfortunately, not much protection there. One fun little piece of information, almost like something that would be useful for a trivia contest one day or something like that. So during the time when these ships were being built, both the Royal Navy and the US Navy ran into similar problems and had to deal with how do you protect the bridge area from the shockwaves from the guns, because what was happening on ships like the Rodney and the Nelson is that when the main guns were fired, there would be a shock wave that hit the the windows on the bridge and would blow the windows out. Well, the Royal Navy tried all sorts of things, like putting shields in place. They were doing all these kinds of things. And the US Navy simply said, well, if we're having an issue with that, why don't we just roll the windows down? That's why you'll notice that on a bunch of these window panes right below them, you'll see that there's like a hand crank to get those windows lowered. Now, this video wouldn't really be about battleships if I don't talk about the guns, which are like the biggest, most obvious things you see when you go see a battleship. And the Wisconsin is equipped with 9 16-inch guns in three gun turrets. 2 turrets in the front, 1 turret in the rear. And these guns were some of the most powerful naval guns ever built. They were 16-inch 50 caliber, and they could fire initially a 2,200-pound shell and later on a 2,700-pound super heavy shell out to a range of about 40 kilometers. If you want to visualize this, per gun was essentially the equivalent of firing, when it was the 2,200-pound shell, it was the equivalent of firing a Volkswagen Beetle, an old one, with like 2 fat guys in it, out to combat range. And later on, when you had the 2,700-pound shells, it was the equivalent of firing a new Volkswagen Beetle, not the flat one, but the sort of the round, cute one, out to about 40k. And these guns packed a wallop. In terms of penetrating power, the Wisconsin's guns were on par with the 2,700-pound shell, were on par to that of the penetration accomplished by the Yamato's guns, which is quite a feat, as the Yamato had guns that were quite a bit larger. But same penetrating power nonetheless. This, combined with the fact that the Wisconsin had pretty damn good fire control, meant the shells that were sent had a pretty high percentage chance of hitting. To get a sense of what it was like to being on the receiving end of an angry battleship's fire, well, you really have to just look at the Gulf War. So during the first Gulf War, a bunch of Iraqi troops were dug into positions, their trenches dug in and everything. And on the first night, the USS Missouri came around and shelled that position, absolutely devastated the crap out of the position. So on the second night, the Wisconsin's drone operators, the ones who were piloting the RPV, flew the drone very, very low over the Iraqi positions, and the Iraqi soldiers heard the buzzing of that drone and knew that if that thing showed up, the battleship was firing on them again. And so these Iraqi soldiers decided, no, I don't want to get shot at again, flew a bunch of white flags and surrendered to the drone. This, of course, caused the drone operators to go, what do we do here? So they called up to the CO and said, sir, they want to surrender, what should I do with them? And this was the first time that soldiers had surrendered to an unmanned aircraft flown from a ship. In terms of secondary armament, the Wisconsin is quite a bit different today than when she was first built. Right now, she still has this, and this one at the back here, right around this one here. She still has these secondary guns, but the other two, this one over here and the other one I want to highlight right over here, these two have been taken away, and they've been replaced by other weapon systems. And they were taken away essentially to make space for them. Now, on the starboard side, the last 5-inch 38 turret is this one with a really, really colorful United States Marine Corps logo. And there's a story behind this one too. So what happened was in the 80s, the commanding officer of the ship basically issued a challenge to the Marines that if they could man their guns better than the regular Navy sailors, they could paint their emblem on it. Well, the Marines obviously went ahead and did just that. They were better, and so they got permission to paint the logo. So they went ahead and they painted it red. And of course, when the CO found out, he was ticked. He was like, you just painted a huge red target on my ship. So they changed it to a gray logo, and when the ship later came out and was no longer in action, they returned it back to its original colors. Speaking of modernizations, the Wisconsin in the 80s, when she was updated with modern weapons and everything, essentially had this whole entire area around here where, if you can see in the original blueprints, were like places for the 40 millimeters and everything. That area was cleared out and missiles were put in place. So there were a total of 16 Harpoon missiles and 32 Tomahawks. So these are the Harpoon launchers, which fired a missile that could engage ships at about 120 kilometers range. So essentially, this missile allowed the Wisconsin to engage a ship 3 times the distance that it could with its main guns. And really, once the Wisconsin got these missiles, it brought her into, first of all, the missile age, and second of all, really gave her that long-range punch that she had lost, with the advent of missiles. The Wisconsin also carried a bunch of Tomahawk missiles as well, and these missiles could engage things up to 1,000-ish kilometers away, depending, of course, on the model of the particular missile that was carried. And they were placed in 8 armored box launchers on the ship. And as you can see here, there's 4 of them at an angle at the back, and there is 4 of them right there in the middle of the ship. Moving deeper into the ship and into the armored portion of the ship, we get to the secondary battery plot, the main battery plot, and of course the CIC. And it's actually a relatively big area when you actually look at the blueprints. The secondary battery and main battery plotting stations are there, and the CIC is there. However, when you actually see the rooms in real life, you'll realize why the Combat Engagement Center was necessary. This is the CIC, and just give me a second, let me pan the camera over. And you'll notice one of the first things is that the room really isn't all that big. And while this was okay for the tasks that the ship needed to accomplish, let's say during the Second World War and during the Korean War and things like that, when it came around to all the new weaponry and all the new sensors and everything else, this area just wasn't big enough. Hence the reason why things were shifted to a completely different room, and that's the reason why the Combat Engagement Center was created. Moving one room over from CIC, we enter main battery plot, and of course right next to this room is secondary battery plot. But it is important to talk about this particular room. This is one of the, let's say, the nerve centers of the ships. This is where the main guns would have been aimed and fired. And of course, you know, where to shoot was actually calculated in this room as well. Yes, in the later stages of the Wisconsin's career, she was primarily dealing with mostly short targets and things like that. But during the Second World War, there was probably on one occasion where there was a probability of, let's say, an Iowa-class battleship, you know, the Wisconsin included, that could have potentially run up against the Yamato. And there's very, very strong debate as to which ship would come out on top. Personally, I would probably put it, you know, about maybe 70 to 30 in favor of the Iowa-class battleships. And mostly it is because of the fact that they had quite superior radar and their fire control was accurate in pretty much all weather conditions. Take a look at, if you want to really sort of look at historical context to see if, you know, something is viable or not, take a look at, for example, the engagement between the U.S. battleships at the Battle of the Leyte Gulf during the particular Battle of the Surigao Strait. And the West Virginia was able to locate the Japanese battleship Yamashiro, basically plot a firing solution and engaged her and was able to land first salvo hits onto the Japanese battleship. And then when you look at the rest of the line of U.S. battleships, the ones that had radar at night, for example, were able to range and fire on the ship. The ones who didn't had to do it optically, and it was a lot harder for them to do so. If you go back to, let's say, the Japanese perspective of this, I mean, if you read the book Japanese Destroyer Captain by Captain Hara, for example, he talks about how in the later stages of the war, American technological superiority, especially with radar fire control, really turned the tables on the Japanese, as their ships would basically sail out, not see anything, and then get hit on first salvo shots from American warships, and that really changed the dynamic of the fighting. One other thing, of course, is that with sort of superior fire control and, of course, the fact that the Iowas had superior speed, they would have been able to pick their zone of engagement. They would have been able to engage when they wanted to and disengage when they wanted to. And as long as they were able to stay outside around, let's say about 30 kilometers or so, they should have been able to land, you know, shots, maybe not perfectly accurately, but they should have been able to land shots. And shots at that distance would have been able to go through the Yamato's armor, as there would have been deck penetrations, and the Yamato's deck armor would have been enough to resist the 2,700-pound Super Heavy Mark 8 shells. So as long as the Iowa-class battleships at that kind of range were able to maintain that range and use their superior fire control, it would have just been a matter of time until they degraded the Yamato's combat capabilities low enough so they could close in and engage at sort of closer distances. To get a sense of, for example, how important speed is in an engagement, one has to look at, let's say, the Battle of the North Cape between the Scharnhorst and HMS Duke of York. And on many occasions during that engagement, the Scharnhorst was able to use her superior speed to essentially turn around and run away and disengage, and also then to turn around and come back in when she pleased. And there was no way for HMS Duke of York to really force that fight. She was just slower than the Scharnhorst. Of course, she did get lucky, managed to land a long-range hit, and eventually took out one of the boilers and, of course, slowed the Scharnhorst down. But that's another story. So as long as I think, again, the Iowa could use her speed to pick her engagements and hammer away at the Yamato at long range, there would be the winning solution, essentially. However, war is still war, and random luck is random luck. And in the event that the Yamato lands a good hit, let's say takes out the radar system, or really takes out, let's say, one of the boilers and reduces the speed of the particular ship, then there's a chance there that the Yamato would be able to claim victory as well. Right? She still had, guns that could pack a punch. She still had really, really strong armor. And so, even though in most cases I think the fight would favor the Iowa-class battleships, one can never rule out an opposing ship. Just because, hey, something random happens, you take a bad hit from a random shell just because Lady Luck doesn't like you that day, and the fight could completely go in the enemy's favor. So that's pretty much how I see Yamato versus Iowa. I do think the Iowas have that technological edge, which I think in most cases would settle the fight in their favor. Alright, moving up one deck from the secondary battery plot room and the main battery plot room, and right in the center of the ship, by the way, is this long passage between turret number 2 and turret number 3. And this long passageway basically gives access to all the engine rooms, all the boiler rooms below, and the sailors nicknamed this Broadway. It's kind of got that, sort of picture in a picture in a picture in a picture effect that you see in some of those paintings. I think it's pretty cool. Also, if you look up right where I'm pointing the green arrow there is a yellow rail that pretty much extends the full length of this passageway. And if they want to transport anything really heavy, for example, like a shell or something, they would just use that railing system. So for those of you who still remember like the Battleship movie where those guys were like manhandling a shell from one end of the ship supposedly to the other, they didn't actually have to do that. They could have just loaded up on that rail and they could have just done it a lot easier. But it's Hollywood, and they gotta make things look dramatic and that much more awesome. I mean, a bunch of men manhandling a shell, that's something, but oh well, two guys sliding a shell down a railing might not be all that impressive movie-wise. So just one of those things about movies that you kind of, once you notice it, you're just like, oh man, why'd they do that? So going from Broadway, which is that long passageway, the next place I visited was the number 1 fire room and the number 1 engine room. Now, to sort of take a really complex thing and make it rather simple, here's like the basic diagram of how a battleship gets pushed forward in the water, or backwards, because ships can go backwards. So the first thing that happens is that water gets fed into the boilers heat it up, turn it into high pressure, high temperature steam. So that's in the fire room. And then that travels over to the high pressure turbine, the HP turbine. And then the high pressure turbine is responsible for pushing the ship forward and only forward, right? So the steam goes in, it turns the turbine, it turns the shaft, and you have some of the power there. Then some of the steam that went through the high pressure turbine has lost some of its energy, so then it goes into something called the low pressure turbine, which is the LP turbine. And then that also turns a shaft. Now the low pressure turbine and the high pressure turbine are different for one thing. High pressure turbines responsible only for pushing the ship forward, low pressure turbines responsible for both forward and backwards. Now, unfortunately, we are talking about a really, really large ship, and we're not talking about an airplane. So you cannot have the propellers of the ship go spinning around at like 5,000 RPM. Okay, 4,500 there. You can't have that. This is not an airplane. So what has to happen is that the really high RPMs that are being turned by the turbines they get put into something called a reduction gear, which drastically reduces the number of RPMs down to a maximum of about 200 for max speed. Now, the remaining steam that passed through all of it is not wasted. It goes into something called a condenser. It condenses back into water, and it gets fed all the way back to the boiler, sort of, making a bit of a cycle there. And that's kind of how it works in a basic kind of way. Of course, I think if you really want to get into details, you'd have to consult a maritime engineer or like a maritime engineering book. But that's a little bit outside my realm of expertise. So, I'll just take you through the engine room real quick and sort of show you some of the key notable things. And this is a look at the first number 1 fire room, and right there to the left, this is boiler number 1. Now, I guess if there's like one thing that the Battleship movie actually got correct, and I'll point that out in a second, is that at least they got the boiler starting sequence bit correct. So if you look down, you'll see that there's a red, sort of like a red port there. And what you do is you light this thing and you stick it in there, and by doing that you're able to light the boilers. So at least they got like one thing right in that movie. Alright, moving away from the fire room, you get into the engine room, and unfortunately I don't have the best picture here, but where the arrow is pointing right now, that is the high pressure turbine, and where the engine is pointing now, that's the low pressure turbine, and what you see right in front of you here, this is the reduction gear. One really cool thing for myself personally as a YouTuber, somebody who has to do a lot of recording and stuff like that, was this particular little box. So the engine room is a pretty noisy place, and so if you're to make a normal phone call, it's pretty hard to hear the other side, and for the other side, it's pretty noisy to hear all the background noise coming through, right? So they constructed this box, padded it on the side with foam, what it looks like, and if you stick your head in here, the noise level drops dramatically, allowing you to actually make phone calls. So it's a pretty neat thing. I should actually do that. Maybe like create some sort of box or something for my recording purposes. It might make some of the background noise go away. Anyways, back to the ship. One of the things that you'll notice as you walk around the Wisconsin is that there are a lot of pieces of art drawn by sailors that have served on the ships before. And it's important to remember that, for a ship to come to life and for its story to be as interesting as it is, a lot of it is based on the crew, and it's the crew that bring life to a ship. And in many cases, I kind of want to know what the story was behind some of these pictures. Like what was the motivation to draw them, or what was the story behind it? Kind of like the way that, I was talking about the 5-inch 38 turret and how the Marines, got their image and the story behind that. See, I kind of wonder when I see a picture like this what the story behind it was. And you'll see it sort of everywhere on the ship in all these random areas, right? Like this one was drawn, I believe, in a secondary battery plot, and it was just on top there. This particular image is pretty cool, just like a drawn picture inside the door. And on the bottom there, you'll see that there's some names, and apparently one of the sailors who served on the ship actually came back many years later and pointed out his name and said, "That's me, I was here many years ago." He does look a little bit like William Shatner, doesn't he? Like the first time I saw the picture, I was just like, whoa, is that Captain Kirk? Then I reminded myself that he was Canadian. Obviously, with a ship as big as the Wisconsin, with as big of a crew, you have to keep them all fed. And that was the job of the various galleys, bakeries, etc. Now, take a look here. This is on the second deck. You'll see that there's the galley area, and this is the butcher area. Here's the galley, and the galley was responsible for feeding the sailors, and they cooked up a storm. If you take a look at how much food was actually consumed in a week, it's a mind-boggling numbers, actually. Although, do keep in mind that the crew was a lot bigger during World War II, so a lot more food was consumed then. So during World War II, this is what was consumed in a week. Some pretty notable numbers include nearly 2,500 pounds worth of meat, 6,500 eggs, 1,200 pounds of potatoes, 2,000 gallons of coffee, because the Navy absolutely lives on coffee, and 217 gallons worth of ice cream. So these were just some pretty interesting numbers. But again, from World War II, so the numbers did decrease as the crew got smaller. Now remember that butcher shop I was telling you about? Well, when the Navy modernized the ships again, the Navy had switched over to prepackaged meats. So butcher shop was no longer necessary, so they converted it into a donut shop. So now on board the battleship, you could get a donut with your morning coffee, and it was a great boost to energy and of course morale. One of the quirky things about ship design is, take a look at this. Look at where the bakery is. Like, there it is, right? Now, remember how ship design is. They do the important stuff first, and then everything else they just kind of find space for. Well, they put the bakery, which is like the nicest smelling thing, right next to the trash burner room. One of the worst smelling parts of the ship. Anyways, moving on to another somewhat fun story. So, take a look at where the Master-at-Arms office is. Take a look at where the bakery is. And there's a fun story here as well. So, one of the last Master-at-Arms chiefs on board the Wisconsin failed 2 physicals in a row, and the second physical was actually worse than the first. And eventually somebody asked him what exactly was going on, and his response was, well, whose bright idea was to put the bakery right next to the Master-at-Arms office? Because what was happening was that every single time they were baking something nice at the bakery, they bring a sample for the chief to try. And so, yeah, his waistline kind of got a little bit big there from all those extra calories. Now, he'd served for many, many years, so the captain was lenient and assigned him to shore duty, where he was able to retire and get a good pension. Aside from being pretty well fed as a sailor on board the Wisconsin, you also had access to quite a bit of reading materials. I mean, here's the library, lots of magazines and books, and if you wanted to study for things, that was totally possible as well. I'm pretty sure that there were books on like the SAT and things like that. Here's a newspaper from way back. I mean, this was like a super old newspaper, and I just thought that was kind of cool, so, you know, took a photo of that. There are copies of books like Jane's Fighting Ship 1980 to 81. I mean, honest to God, if I had another day to spend at the museum, I think I would have just gone in there, sat down at the library, and just gone through and read some of these books. There were just so many things I wanted to read, but unfortunately, time constraints. Oh well, next time. I'll do it next time. They also had VHS tapes, and I'm pretty sure that's what they were doing movie nights with, so that was also a form of entertainment aboard the ship. But it wasn't always fun and games. You know, of course, sometimes you would get sick, things would happen, and a battleship was well equipped to take care of you. If you take a look at this top-down view of the third deck, you'll notice that there's things like an operating room, there are dispensaries, there are doctor's offices, sick bays, medical stores, all these things that, you know, you could go and essentially get better. In fact, battleships, much like the way carriers are, actually offered medical care for the smaller ships around them that didn't have such complete medical facilities. So, for example, a destroyer in the fleet, if they had somebody who, you know, got sick or whatever, they could send them to a battleship. This is the surgical room on the Wisconsin. They're, I think, in the process of getting it ready so that they can show you in the future. I actually got to see a lot of rooms that weren't open yet, but this is still pretty neat to see. I mean, this is the surgical room, and you think that that's where they would perform life-saving surgery. This is the pharmacy on the ship. I know it's a little bit dark, but there's a tiny little sign at the top there that says pharmacy, if you can actually see it. This is where they would dispense medicines. And then, of course, there was an x-ray room as well, just so you can get an idea of the medical equipment that was available on a battleship. One other part that's a little bit a ways from the area that I just showed you, one deck up and a little bit further, I think, aft, is the dental clinic. And this is where they would take care of your dental needs. So on board a ship, they could totally fill your cavities or pull your rotten tooth. One final piece of super random trivia for all of you, and here I am shooting at the bow part of the ship, is that the Wisconsin is nicknamed the Whiskey, and there's a reason for that. It's because back in 1956, the Wisconsin was involved in a collision with the USS Eaton, and her bow suffered pretty heavy damage, like that. And so they had to do something to repair it. So what they did was they took the bow from the unfinished USS Kentucky and put it together, and hence the nickname Whiskey. Wisconsin, Kentucky. Does that work for you guys? But anyways, there's a piece of random fact. Maybe one day it'll come up in some form of naval trivia, and you're gonna nail that question. And that does it for me this episode, folks. I hope you enjoyed my somewhat brief episode on the USS Wisconsin. If you go there in person, there's so much more to see and so many more stories to hear. Special thanks, of course, goes to the veterans for your service. Jacob, you're an amazing docent. Thank you so much for spending 8 hours taking me through the ship. Folks, if you visit the ship, ask for Jacob. He's an amazing docent. And of course, the Nauticus Museum at Norfolk, Virginia. Tim Andros, of course, for the drone footage. And of course, thank you so much, patrons, for your support. You guys rock. And especially after what's happened recently, knowing that you guys were supporting me allowed me to take time off, take care of the family, and of course get back to doing what I love. Thank you all so, so much. Anyways, folks, take care. Have yourselves a good one, and I'll talk to all of you again soon.